Welcome to the New Mormon Truth, video number 20, the Second Great Awakening, part 1. This video provides context for the restoration, and that we're going to discuss the Second Great Awakening. And I'm going to cover information and church sources. And then I'm going to discuss the cause of the Second Great Awakening. And I assert that the use of any copyrighted material in this video is fair use. So the question could be asked, why are we discussing the Second Great Awakening? Well, a quote from Kim Elliott of the Khan Academy says, the Second Great Awakening was one of the most important social, religious, and cultural aspects of the early 19th century in the United States. In fact, I might even make the argument that it is impossible to understand this early 19th century without understanding the Second Great Awakening. This is why we're going to discuss it, because it's very important, and it might be impossible to understand the early 19th century. So, my videos, or these series of videos, is taking information for primary church sources. Saints Volume 1. The Second Great Awakening is not specifically mentioned, but there is some information in the supplemental material. The teacher's manual has no information, or maybe no specific mention, and just like the comprehensive, the church has no specific mention of the Second Great Awakening. And there's a little bit of information in Chapter 1 of the Church History in the Fullness of Times. So basically, most church sources usually just mention the revivals or the religious debates happening at the time of the first vision in 1820. For example, just out of Saints, you can find it on these pages and in the teacher's manual on basically pages 9, 11, and 12. So there is information in the supplemental material in Saints Volume 1. Like I said, it doesn't directly refer to it, but it does discuss, at least these supplemental sources do discuss the increased religious choice as a result of population growth, and the dissolving of state-sponsored, tax-supported churches. So let's look at these quotes from the supplemental material. So this is page 9, footnote 15. So that takes you, it's not in the text itself, it's not in the back of the book, and actually you have to go look it up. If you're online, you can just click on the link and it'll take you to these articles. So one of the articles, called Palmyra and Manchester, it says, beginning in the late 1700s, New Englanders moved to Western New York in droves, attracted by the fertile soil and cheap acreage. The completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 added to the boom, and the small village of Palmyra quickly turned into a trading center. So people like to say Joseph Smith was from a small town. Well, probably Manchester was small, but starting in 1825, Palmyra was no more a small city. So with the growing population came increased religious diversity, as Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Quakers all converged on the area and began vying for converts. And then another article called Christian Churches in Joseph Smith's Day. This is once again in the supplemental material. It says, the colonial government in British America, this is this is when the 13 states, or the 13 colonies, were under British control. So the colonial government in British America followed a European precedent by sponsoring certain churches with official charters and supporting them with tax revenue. So this is what you had. You had, America, we have separation of church and state. Well, back then, the church and the state were combined, or at least the churches were officially sanctioned or sponsored by the states and supported by tax revenue. Then the article continues, religious choice expanded after the founding of the United States in the late 1700s. The United States Constitution and eventually individual state legislatures dissolved the charters of state-sponsored churches, opening the way for many alternatives to flourish. Basically, if you're a new religion, you had to be supported some way, and this is, you're going to have people support you. But the state-supported churches had the tax revenue. So with the dissolving of these state churches, it opened the way for new religions or for other religions to have support. So moving on, so that was information from Saints Volume 1 in the supplemental material. Now in the Church History in the Fullness of Times, it actually directly addresses the Second Great Awakening, and here's a summary of what we're going to read. It basically, the Second Great Awakening introduced the belief in the need of a restoration of New Testament Christianity. So this was nothing new to the LDS Church, but it was actually a movement called the Restoration Movement during the Second Great Awakening, as we'll find out. We'll discuss revivals, which are emotionally charged camp meetings where people got together and heard these very emotional speeches or talks by preachers. And discuss the formation of volunteer associations. And it talked about the growth of the Methodists and Baptists. This is the information, or this is what we're going to read about in the Church History in the Fullness of Time. So let's get to the quotes. So it says, concurrent with the American Revolution and the establishment of the Constitution was a second great awakening that brought about a reorientation of Christian thinking. Of course, it doesn't tell us what it was and what it went to. It just says it was reoriented. And the text continues, many beliefs were introduced in the new nation, including the idea that there was a need for a restoration of New Testament Christianity. So this was a new idea during the Second Great Awakening. These those searching for this restoration were known as seekers. Many of them were ripe for the divine restoration and became its early converts. So basically you have the Second Great Awakening, you have this idea of the need for restoration of New Testament Christianity. These people were called seekers, and these people became the church's early converts. We should say it's not shocking for those who are looking for a restoration of New Testament Christianity who would find the church. So, and then the article or the book or that chapter 1 continues. Almost concurrently with the Second Great Awakening, there arose a spirit of a revivalism. Itinerant, that's basically traveling preachers, held spirited camp meetings, and by spirited they mean emotional. So these itinerant preachers held spirited camp meetings among new settlers in frontier areas of the growing United States. Lonely settlers from farms and villages gathered in huge crowds, literally in the hundreds and thousands, to enjoy the camp meetings. Noisy but gifted preachers lent a festive air to these religious gatherings while trying to win converts to their faith. So this is how the Church History in the Fullness of Times discusses the Second Great Awakening. And it continues, the Second Great Awakening also influenced the formation of volunteer associations to promote missionary work, education, moral reform, and humanitarianism. Doesn't really tell you what, besides missionary work, you're not too sure what this really means. Revivals brought religious emotions to a fever pitch and aided the growth of the popular denominations, particularly the Methodists and Baptists. This religious awakening lasted for at least 40 years, including the time of Joseph Smith's first vision. So clearly the church material says that that the time of the first vision, or the Second Great Awakening, the time span, or this first vision is included in the time span of the Second Great Awakening. So now that's the material in this from the church about the Second Great Awakening. Now let's get into the Second Great Awakening. So let's try to put Saints, Volume 1, and the Church History and Fullness of Times just sort of brings broad strokes over the Second Great Awakening. Now, I'm not really faulting them for getting into the details, because you can't cover everything. But as you know, the Kim Elliott from the Khan Academy said that this is a very Second Great Awakening was very important. So I think we need to drill a little bit deeper, and I wish the church material would have spent a little bit going into depth about the Second Great Awakening. So that's what we're going to do over 2 parts. So this is part 1, the causes of the Second Great Awakening. So let's first date the Second Great Awakening. When did the Second Great Awakening occur? Because the church material here just says 40 years, at least 40 years, and it talks about, the beginning of America and all that. So let's try to date the Second Great Awakening. Obviously, I have a date there. So when did the Second Great Awakening occur? Well, the events of the Second Great Awakening generally occurred between 1795 and 1835. This is according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. But the sources I read date the Second Great Awakening to about from 1790 to about 1860. I don't really see anyone going earlier than 1790, and sometimes you'd even see 10 or 20 years later right here in some of the sources, but generally it's between these years. So the Church History and Fullness of Time said at least 40. This is Encyclopedia Britannica has exactly 40, and most of the sources have about 70. It's about a 70-year span. But the sources also say the most intense period of the Second Great Awakening was in the 1820s and 30s. Wow, this is right during the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and this is the early church. So the sources say this is the most intense period, and then Encyclopedia Britannica actually says the intense Western New York period, where the Smiths lived. So it just talks about the Western New York period. The most intense period was between 1825 and 1835. So during this 10-year span, once again, this is actually the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and the early church. Now it is true that in 1830-31, the church actually moved from New York to Ohio. So this is basically the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and the early church, right in Western New York. So now let's talk about the causes of the Second Great Awakening, or what caused it. I think I have four main reasons. The First Amendment, 1791, it stopped the state-supported religion and left religion to the people. This was actually covered. This was mentioned in Saints Volume 1 about the tax support. Believe it or not, this is not mentioned in too many sources. Also, American exceptionalism. This is the belief that God chose America as a model for other nations. And then number 3 causes westward expansion. Basically, in that, I'm going to subdivide that into manifest destiny. This is the concept that God destined the U.S. to expand across North America. Notice that these two are God chose America and God destined the United States. With westward expansion, frontier, or the pioneering spirit, basically with the concept that people shape their own destiny or fate. And the fourth is millenniarism. Well, I did not say that right. Basically, Jesus' return and his 1,000-year rule was just around the corner, with the key phrase being just around the corner. We'll get into that more. So let's talk about the First Amendment. So reason number 1, the First Amendment, 1791, left religion to the people. This caused the dissolving of state-sponsored, tax-supported churches. Once again, the key thing is tax-supported. Now support would have to come from private resources. And according to one source, which was a book, I forget which one it was, basically the tax-supported, state-sponsored churches were all phased out by 1833. So you can see this. I mean, if you're a tax-supported, state-sponsored church, you're getting all your money. And all of a sudden that ended. Now you're going to have to go Now you have to go to your parishioners and ask for money. This also means that ones that weren't supported by the states now could compete for that money. So they could actually now go to converts, since converts or people or parishioners could give money to whoever they wanted. It automatically wasn't being taken out of taxes and given to a certain church. So this was a loss of support for the state-sponsored Congregational and Presbyterian churches. These were the primary churches. These basically had, I want to point out, these had Calvinistic theology. Calvinistic theology is probably dominated by the predestination of the elect to heaven. And this meant new support for the Baptist and Methodist churches. So you can see some of the church sources saying growth of the Baptist and Methodist churches. Well, that's because they were now people could support them. So, and I also want to point out that they had Armenian theology. I covered this in another video, differences between these. But Armenianism theology basically has you're in charge of your fate, or all have a chance for heaven, and what you do matters. So reason number 2, or cause number 2 of the Second Great Awakening, was American exceptionalism. So many Puritans believed that God had chosen America as a model for other nations, a city upon the hill. So America was the model. They came here to set up, the ideal place. Historian Thomas Kidd stated in 2010, with the onset of the Revolutionary Crisis, the Revolutionary War, a significant conceptual shift convinced Americans across the theological spectrum that God was raising up America for some particular purpose. So here's an historian talking about American exceptionalism. If you think about it, the 13 states. So, they were 13 colonies, and then they, with the Declaration of Independence, they said they were 13 independent states. And if you think about it, the 13 states had just defeated the British twice in the American Revolution in the War of 1812. And just remember that when we defeated the British in 1812, the British had just defeated Napoleon. So, the British had to get together with other European countries to defeat Napoleon. So here we defeat the British, but the British had just defeated Napoleon, so this must have been a big victory. The 13 states had just ended governance of a monarch, thrown off the tyranny of a monarch, and set up a democracy. Basically, no one's going to rule us, but we're going to decide how we want to govern ourselves. We beat the big dog. We said we're not going to be ruled by you. We're going to do it our way, and then they established religious freedom. A light upon a hill. God was raising us up. Who else could do this but God? So this is sort of American exceptionalism. So, whoops, all these were supposed to come in, all these bullet points separately. So westward expansion is the next item, and I want to talk about first the market revolution. So there was a revolution in transportation. So you had the Erie Canal, the railroad, the steamships for traveling up and down mostly the Mississippi River, things like that. It made it easier to transport goods to distant markets. And the telegraph made it easier to communicate to distant business people that you didn't know. So imagine you were living in Palmyra, and maybe you were growing on a farm. Before the Erie Canal and long distance shipping and communication, you basically had to sell to a local market. But with the Erie Canal, you could actually sell all the way down to New York, and it could be transported there. So now, it made sense to live in Palmyra. Before, if you want to get it to a distant market that wasn't maybe really viable, you had to live near that market. So if you want to ship to or have your goods sold in New York, you had to live near New York. But now with the market revolution, you could live further away and ship that and communicate. And also people began working in factories. Before this, most families worked on a farm. So with westward expansion, that was the mark of revolution, just a map of westward expansion. Remember, the colonies were here. After the American Revolution, United States got all the territory basically east of the Mississippi. Then there was the Louisiana Purchase, and then in 1819 we're going to get Florida. Then you can see the dates down here in the 1840s, the rest of America. So westward expansion. So just a summary, when the states were just colonies, the British forbid expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. I'm using my cursor to show about the Appalachian Mountains are about here. So people had to stay to the east coast, to the Appalachian Mountains. In 1790, 94% of the population lived in the 13 states. By 1820, 75% of the population lived in the 13 states. So, roughly 20% of the people, I don't know if that's, but, moved. At least the population shifted. The next bullet is about during 1790 and 1820, about 800,000 people moved west. And the church participation declined for these people. They moved there. Maybe there's no churches to begin with. So, decline in religious participation. Causes of this westward expansion, as I mentioned, westward expansion was at least due in part driven by the market revolution. Once again, being able to get your goods to distant markets. It could also be caused by the year without a summer. So in 1816 or 1815, that's when the volcano exploded and it caused the year without a summer. One source, many left the New England area and moved west. And one source says between 10 and 15,000 people left Vermont alone. I don't know how many, couldn't find a source of how many people actually moved there in the year without a summer. But the only one I could find was Vermont. So another aspect of westward expansion was manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the belief that God had destined the United States to expand across North America. So started here, and we were gathering territory, first the Mississippi, then the Louisiana Purchase, then Florida. I think these are my bullet items. Oh yeah, 1873, the American Revolution. We get everything east of the Mississippi. I know it's faded, but everything in brown here. And then we get the Louisiana Purchase, everything in green. In 1819, Florida's acquired down here. And then in 1823, President James Monroe tells European nations not to interfere with U.S. westward expansion. Get out of our way. We're going towards the west coast. So with westward expansion was also the pioneering spirit. That is basically the willingness to endure hardships in new places or things. The trailblazers. And with that came the rugged individual, meaning this is the idea of sort of like, hey, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I mean, this sort of goes hand in hand, right? You're not going to go out. I mean, if you're going out somewhere, new places and new things in the wilderness, you're going to have to be a person that pulls themselves up by the bootstraps. So this sort of goes hand in hand. And the big note to take away from this is that people took their destiny or fate into their own hands. This belief of control over one's fate is expressed in Arminianism. So this will factor in later. But, if you believed that you're predestined to heaven, maybe you're not going to take a chance. Hey, I'm good here. But if you have this idea, or you would be more inclined towards Arminianism if you also were a person that was thinking about the pioneering spirit, that I'm willing to do new things because my fate is in my hands. So if you already thought that, if you're going to move to a new area, then, your philosophy, personal philosophy, is probably more conducive with Arminianism. We'll discuss this a little bit later. So the word I continue to mispronounce, millenarianism. This is Jesus' apocalyptical return and rule over 1,000-year paradise was just around the corner. Because if it isn't just around the corner, then you don't need to do anything, right? If Jesus' return is in 100 years, then why bother? Nothing to worry about. But if it's just going to happen, or it's just a few years off, or it's going to happen this year, you're going to do something about it. Causes? Well, I'm going to say it was Matthew chapter 24, which says, "And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." So wars, but the end isn't there yet. "And nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places. And all these are the beginning of sorrows." So this is just the beginning. But it's just around the corner. So remember that the people had just, I guess some of the older people, there's the French and Indian War, there's the American Revolution, and then the ones that I'm going to highlight, the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and starting in 1803. Remember, the Second Great Awakening really starts getting kicked off in the 1820s. So something right around this time frame really kicked it off. So, you had the taxation in 1791, that probably gets it kicked off. But then you have the wars and rumors of wars. This is really kingdom against kingdom, nation against nation. This is all going on in Europe for those 12 years. Then you have the War of 1812 in America. The war is on your home front. It's on your soil. So I think these is the wars and rumors of wars. And then you had the year without summer in 1816. Right before this 1820, when it really starts heating up. The Second Great Awakening starts heating up. Then this quote from Saints Volume 1 regarding the volcanic eruption in 1815 says, "In Europe, food supplies dwindled, leading to starvation and panic. In France and Britain, citizens fell to their knees, fearful that the terrible calamities foretold in the Bible were upon them." Well, why would they believe that? Well, it had to be Matthew chapter 24. In North America, ministers preached that God was punishing wayward Christians, and they sounded warnings to stoke religious feelings. Saints Volume 1, page 4. So some Protestants believe that American progress towards making heaven on earth would help start the millennium. So how are they going to accomplish this? So basically the idea is that, Jesus is going to come, but if we make heaven on earth, that will help it start. So one, you got to convert the people to Christianity and have them repent of personal sin. Sin isn't bold. How are they going to do this? Revivals. Revivals were mainly a Methodist. These camp meetings were mainly a Methodist method. And but there were also missionary societies from the Congregationalists, and there's Christian education societies like American Bible Society started in 1816. Accomplished by number 2, people needed to remove sin from society. So method, creation of reform movements and volunteer societies. So the church sources mention these volunteer societies, but they don't, what caused these? Why did these happen? People just suddenly decide to do these? No. It's because they're thinking Jesus was coming just around the corner and they need to remove sin from society. So they're going to do these reform movements and, temperance, end drinking, end slavery with abolition, women's rights, prison reform, care for the handicapped and mentally ill. These were going on. You're going to make society a better place. So we'll have heaven on earth when Jesus comes. Well, that's it for this part 1. Here are my sources. You can look at them here and just pause for a few seconds on each slide, or you can click on the link.